My name is Tom Leonard. I'm a senior fellow and president emeritus at TPI, and we're delighted to have you here for our program this morning on antitrust and the platform economy. As you all know, antitrust and competition policy have suddenly become hot issues. The issues du jour, the AT&T Time Warner merger at the Justice Department and the net neutrality issue at the FCC, which is also a competition issue, are no longer relegated to the business section and the trade press, and they even make it, at least in my household, they even make it into Thanksgiving table dinner conversation. Add a little bit of excitement. But there's a broader and really more fundamental policy place that's also taking place simultaneously. And that's driven by two factors. On the one hand, the growth of populist sentiment, and that's combined with the emergence of the large internet platforms like Amazon, Apple, Google, and Facebook. One side in this argument argues that the standard economics-based antitrust enforcement that's developed over the past 40 years has allowed these companies to amass too much economic and political power, and that the scope and goals of antitrust should be expanded, or at the minimum, enforcement should be significantly more assertive than it is today. And on the other side argues that the current standards and goals of antitrust, which focus on consumer welfare, have largely served consumers and competition well, and that our current economics-based approach to antitrust can address whatever competitions arise, even with the large digital platforms. So this conference is actually part of a broader TPI project that's going to produce papers and additional events addressing the questions that define this debate. And some of those questions are, is there a platform monopoly problem? And if so, can it be addressed by current antitrust enforcement? Is big data an antitrust problem? Is the consumer welfare standard, which has guided antitrust policy for the past several decades, still sufficient? And should we have a more aggressive merger review process, and in particular, do agencies sufficiently incorporate effects on innovation into merger reviews? As probably most of you know, we had planned to have the chief of the Antitrust Division, Macon Delrahim, as our luncheon speaker today. We're very sorry he's unable to be here. He unfortunately ran into some last-minute scheduling problems. But we do have, I think, what's a great panel, nonetheless, with great depth of knowledge and experience about these issues. I'm going to give them each, because this is, these are all very serious subjects. I'm going to give them each a longer period of time than we sometimes have for introductory remarks, 10 to 12 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for discussion amongst the panelists and hopefully ample time for you all to get involved. You all have. I'll briefly introduce the panelists. You all have their more detailed bios in the handout. Michael Katz is the Sarin Chair in Strategy and Leadership and Professor Emeritus at the Department of Economics, the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. He's also a former chief economist at the Antitrust Division. Diana Moss is the president of the American Antitrust Institute. Larry Wright is the Robert Cavish Professor of Economics and Deputy Chair of Economics at the Stern School of Business at NYU, and also a former chief economist at the Antitrust Division. And Josh Wright is the Executive Director of the Global Antitrust Institute and a professor at the Anton and Scalia Law School at George Mason University, as well as holding an appointment in the Department of Economics, and is a former commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission. I think I'll just go in alphabetical order, if that's okay. Michael?
Maybe that was a trick question because I couldn't figure out what the alphabetical order was quickly enough to say no. So we can just put this some view of what I'm about. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a vote of confidence that so many of you showed up, or it just shows how few people check their email because they're too busy looking on Twitter. Is there a clicker?
Check.
Anyway, I'm going to, there's a few remarks, sort of middle of the road ones. Actually, well, you'll see. So I think I want to start with, there are a couple of what I think are key points. And first, there is a lot of going on about platforms. And okay. And you see both, as Tom mentioned, a lot of people saying, wait a minute, we've got to do a lot more about platforms. We need more stringent antitrust. Maybe we need new rules. There's also a big move afoot, sort of in the opposite direction, saying, oh, platforms are too hard to understand. Maybe we need new rules for them, but those new rules are actually, I think most people would see as more permissive, and maybe another view is they're too complicated to do anything about, so just leave them alone. And what I like to say is I think both of those views are wrong, both because they're wrong in the details, but also there's just, I think, too much focus on the label of platform. Because the fact of the matter is, and I'm not going to go into details here, there's not a consensus on what it means to be a platform. There's not a universally agreed precise definition. There are some popular precise definitions, although they tend to include all firms. And so one thing I think is it's a big mistake to start having policies or legal treatment of firms hinge on whether or not they're labeled a platform. As you'll see, this is not to say that platforms don't have distinctive characteristics, but we need to focus on those characteristics rather than just say, oh, if we put this label on, flip a switch, let's do things differently. Second thing is that antitrust is fact-intensive, and there are differences among the leading platforms, and I think there's sometimes a tendency to sort of lump a bunch of them together, the big 4 or 5, whatever, depending on how you feel about Microsoft and Netflix. But in fact, there are big differences both in sort of the source of their market position, and some would say their market power, and what the effects of various actions would be on efficiency and on those firms. And so again, it's a mistake, I think, to say, well, what should we do to all platforms? Now, there's some semantics here because of what you say, well, we should do to every platform is we should consider them carefully and look at the facts and apply appropriate law. Well, yeah, you should treat them all the same. But if you say things like, they all should be broken up, or they all should be banned from vertically integrating, or they all should have to share data, I think that sort of thing is a big mistake. Okay, but now, having said that we don't agree what constitutes a platform, we clearly, if you talk about platforms, have a bunch of the same firms in mind, and people worrying about Facebook and Google and Amazon, and a broader set of firms. And there are some characteristics I think we do tend to associate with all these firms. So one would be the existence of network effects, right? That the more people on the platform, the more valuable it is to being on the platform, and in particular, the concern with cross-platform network effects, where one group of users wants to be on the platform to be with the other. The easiest one seen in that is something like, say, Google, where you want to be on the network. If you're an advertiser, you want to be on it because that's where the searchers are and that's your advertising audience. With something like Facebook, you have a similar dynamic, but you also then have people who want to be people on the same side of the platform, which is, and I'm not one of them, the people who want to show photos of what they ate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner and share it with all their friends. And unfortunately, I have a lot of friends who do that. And then you can say, well, why are you on Facebook? And it's because I can't remember people's birthdays, and it does have that one useful feature. Okay. That was in just for my wife, because she asked me that question a lot. Okay, so there are network effects. And she is not on Facebook, except for the time she tried to spy on her now son-in-law, but that didn't go well. I will get to privacy. Okay, another factor, you shouldn't have told me I had extra time. Another factor is the use of large-scale data analytics, and in particular the issue about big data. Things people sort of forget, but more sort of old-fashioned, is that these platforms, right, have heavy reliance on software and intellectual property. Okay? And also that most of these have huge physical infrastructures to go along with that. Now, so what? Well, and that's where I get to, what does it mean for competition policy? Well, in terms of competition, all of those factors I just listed are sources of increasing returns. And we'll see in some cases it's to scale, it could be to scope, it could be to experience, but in all those cases, they're giving rise to benefits of size, okay? Which means that we're going to tend to see in equilibrium higher levels of concentration. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that that in itself is a problem. It does mean the markets in some ways are going to tend to be less competitive, but that doesn't mean that's something that antitrust can do anything about. It may just be a fact of life, but it does tell us it's going to create market structures where we may be concerned about anti-competitive behavior. But the other thing which I'll talk about briefly is it does open up avenues for anti-competitive behavior, and in particular forms of exclusion or predation and raising rivals' costs. And then I'll try to say very briefly this question about what about privacy. Okay, so I'm going to go through this really quickly. I'm going to focus on data just because it's probably the newest of those considerations that get so much attention. But certainly data can give rise to economies of scale, that having more data you can offer a higher quality product. It also has experience effects, and this is the main thing I want you to take away from this, is the difference between the two, that the experience effects, what I mean is it's having data about past behavior or data from your past operations of your firm can then help you in the future. Okay? And that's important, and the reason for the distinction between the scale and experience is that there's this intertemporal linkage. That if you were ahead in the past and collected more data, in the case of the experience effects, it's actually going to help you in the future. Whereas the scale, if I was the biggest firm last period, but I'm not the biggest this period, I'm not going to have the advantage of scale over my rival. Okay? And then economies of scope is just saying that the data could actually help you across multiple industries or multiple markets. Okay. So what about this? Well, as I say, I want to focus on the experience effects, which either could be because of data, or also because of network effects, that if you've built up a big installed base in the past and people expect it to continue, that's going to help you in the future. So why do we care about these experience effects potentially? Well, first, I want to talk about exclusion. I have to tell you, well, what do I mean by exclusion? Because, in fact, there are a lot of different definitions of exclusion, none of which I think is universally accepted. I have up here the one I think is the one typically used by the Antitrust Division, and I think has a lot of merit, although there's some problems with it too. And it says that conduct's exclusionary if really the only reason you engaged in the conduct as a firm was to harm your rivals and to weaken competition. Okay? So what I want to do is think about that definition and think about what it would mean for predatory pricing and the effect of either these data experience effects or network effects. Okay? And this is probably a lot of you know, right under the Brook Group standard, the Supreme Court put forth, in the US, when you evaluate predatory pricing, there's a cost prong. You ask, are prices below some appropriate measure of cost, where appropriate is to be determined? And then there's also a recoupment prong. You ask, was there a reasonable probability or reasonable expectation that the firm would recoup the losses it suffered by pricing below cost by earning higher profits in the future? Okay, so let's think about what those could mean in a world where data are really critical and you need to either build up a big base of data about your users or you need to build up a big base of users themselves for a network effect. Well, one thing that comes out of that is that below-cost pricing can be perfectly rational as a pro-competitive strategy. Right? And that's what I put here as innocent pricing. Because what are you doing? You're investing in having more data, which is sort of by definition here of the case we're looking at, you're investing in more data because it allows you to offer a better product to consumers, or at least a more profitable product. Or you're investing in building up a user base, which then makes your platform more attractive to users. So there's nothing, I would say, anti-competitive about that. Okay, so that you can see is going to be a problem in applying the cost prong, because the fact that you're pricing below cost by itself doesn't mean you're being anti-competitive. And things are actually getting a little worse for the cost prong, because the fact that you're pricing above cost also doesn't prove you're innocent, okay, at least by this definition of exclusion, because it may be that what you would have done if all you were trying to do is maximize your profits and not hurt your competitor as part of that, is you would have priced well above cost, but you decide what you're going to do is you're going to charge, rather than charge the high price you would have, you'll charge, say, an intermediate price, still a price above cost, but you're lowering your price precisely to get more of the market share to keep your rival from accumulating data or accumulating users. And under this definition, it would say that lowering the price from the high level to the medium level would fall under that definition, because the reason you're doing it is the benefits of weakening your rival by denying it access either to the users or to the user data. Okay, so the cost prong really runs into some problems here, because, as I say, there are innocent reasons to invest in getting it, but there are also, it simultaneously creates an innocent reason to price below cost because you're investing in your future, but it also creates a mechanism for potentially successful predation and for harming competition. So then we say, well, maybe the recoupment prong will save us. Well, partly that it can, but it depends on what you mean by that. Because if what you mean by a recoupment prong is you say, okay, we saw that the firm priced below cost. Did it have an expectation that that would be profitable? Well, the answer better be yes, because otherwise the firm is irrational. So if the answer is yes, you say, okay, the firm's rational. It's like saying the firm made an investment. Did it expect the investment to pay off? And you say, well, yes, that's why they made it. And you say, aha, that shows their what? It shows they thought they were going to get the investment to work. So it's not the fact that they priced below cost and expected to make money that's going to tell you the answer, whether or not this is anti-competitive. You're going to have to look at the specific mechanism by which they recoup. Are they recouping the below-cost pricing investment because it's giving them a bigger network base, bigger user base, a bigger base of data, and allowing them to improve their product, in which case you say, that's fine, they're rational and they're doing good stuff? Or is the recoupment working because what they've done is they've denied their rival access to data or denied their rival access to a user base? So that's why what I put up here is saying it's not about the recoupment itself, it's the recoupment mechanism that's going to matter. So if we're going to look at these things, we've got to look at the right measures, the right way to do it. Okay, a couple other things. Let me just mention some things people have talked about, and particularly having to do with data. So some people said, well, let's have mandatory data sharing, or we should make firms divest of data. And that's actually, in some ways, is a new issue. I mean, a lot of these things have come up, we've seen before. We've seen these things with experience effects. In other ways, where firms have learning by doing, it's an advantage that you were bigger in the past. You know better how to run your business. But unlike traditional experience effects or learning by doing, which often result in tacit knowledge, here we're talking about sort of tangible data that could be, you could force people to share. But I would say here we should remember that the data didn't come free. Right? I mean, the firms did have to collect it, and also, in a lot of cases, the data we're interested in is actually, it's not just sort of saying, oh, well, consumers just did stuff and the firm happened to see it. It's that the firm did things, interacted with the consumers, and the data generated is partly due to consumer conduct, but it's also due to the firm's conduct. So, for example, if you said, I want to see how people have responded to a menu of search results and which ones they clicked on, what it meant, of course, the menu they're offered is going to affect that, so you could, I think, reasonably argue that that's the firm's intellectual property. So I think we have to tread cautiously here. There's a reason we don't have duty to deal. We don't want to undermine investment incentives, either undermining the firm's investment to collect the data because it's just going to have to share it with its rivals so it's not gaining competitive advantage, or also undermining your incentives. You say, why should I collect it? I'll get somebody else to do it, and then impose a duty to deal on them. Another thing some people have talked about is saying, well, let's not let firms use the data that they have, or let's not let them use it to go into other markets. The problem with that is it's basically an efficiencies offense, and I realize because we live in an age where satire and irony are totally dead. So that's why I put, that's not a good thing. I was not saying the efficiencies offense or whatever is a good, and the problem with it, of course, is one of the reasons it's giving the firms an advantage is it is allowing them to have lower costs or offer a higher quality product, and you're denying those benefits. So where do I come out with sort of the wishy-washy, but I think correct? Then look, all of these things, I think I'm against, I guess, as a general matter, sort of going after size per se, and I think if you look at the history of antitrust cases, it's certainly in recent decades is true. What we do is we go after specific anti-competitive conduct. And certainly firms could misuse data. And I certainly think in the case of mergers, it can make sense to think about forcing the firms to divest of data. And we've seen similar things where firms have had to divest of intellectual property as a condition for merging. But all of that is in response to specific anti-competitive conduct. The last thing, I'll just say something about privacy. And when I say not my problem, I'm speaking here on behalf of all competition policy enforcers everywhere. That's what I mean by my. And so I really mean here, and by the way, I was going to try to do Big Brother with George Orwell and this and that, and I realized no one would know what that was, so I figured better to go with the TV show. Okay. Which may actually speak to a different thing, which is if you're below a certain age, privacy is not a problem because you don't know what it is and don't care. I'm old enough, I do care. And I certainly do not want to be seen on TV in a hot tub. And you don't want to see me on TV in a hot tub. All right, so what do I mean by that? Well, a couple of things. First off, interesting enough, I think it's not so clear that competition is good for privacy. Okay. Now, generally, and I'm not dumping on competition. Competition is good stuff. It promotes consumer welfare. But this is similar to this question that has come up for years about, when monopolists, we think of monopolists as restricting output and charging overly high prices. It's not true that a profit-maximizing monopolist necessarily restricts quality. Okay, the monopolist actually is well established, could have quality, for example, that's too high, and you can have a similar thing with privacy. The fact that you're a monopoly means, yes, you want to extract what you can out of consumers and make whatever profits you can, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to violate privacy. What you're going to figure out is, well, what are consumers willing to pay for privacy? What are the trade-offs? And you try to optimize against that. And mind you, that's if you're an economically rational firm, you'll try to do that. So it's not evident that competition is going to actually make things better, that somehow competitive firms are going to make that trade-off better, okay? Because in some ways it's saying what happens at the margin. Now the other thing is it actually could make things worse, I think, in that if you think about platforms on these different sides, like say you're an advertising-supported platform, if there's more competition to serve advertisers, it could well be that the only way you're going to be able to prosper is in fact by having less privacy for your users on the other side, and the competitive pressures. Just the way we can think of as competition promoting innovation, you can also think of competition as promoting undermining privacy, because it's a way that you're going to then have a more attractive product on the other side. And so I think it's a two-edged sword. And the other thing, and people pointed this out actually, a similar thing with competition and airline safety, which is a lot more depressing topic. But that one of the disadvantages of competition can be that it can promote what I'll call reputational risk-taking, which is to say, if you play by the rules and you don't violate people's privacy and this and that, you may be doomed to earn essentially zero profits, whereas you say, okay, let me gamble. I'm going to start doing a bunch of sleazy things where, I lie about what my privacy policies are, but as long as I don't get caught, I'll make a lot of money. And it's worth trying, because if I play by the rules, I'm not going to make any money. So a competition actually can have perverse incentive effects, because with strong enough competition, the only way to win is to cheat. And again, I am not endorsing that. I am just pointing out that that could be a possibility. So last thing on that. So okay, that says maybe promoting competition itself is not a way to promote privacy. There are other issues. Also should note that privacy regulation can actually harm entry to the extent it makes it harder for firms to get certain kinds of information, and it may, if you allow firms to use it internally, just furthers the economy of the scope. And lastly, I'll just say that data ownership, I think, is not the answer. A lot of people say, oh, let's just give consumers control of their data, then that will solve all these problems. And I think that's just not true, that it's going to work that way, because you have to ask, what happens if the consumer says, okay, I own the data, I don't want to give it to you, or I don't want to sell it to you, what happens? And if a firm says, well, if you don't sell it to us, take the case of an employer, it's the easiest to see. So you say to people, hey, you have the right not to tell the employer certain things about you. And then the employer says, okay, I'm going to ask you. You don't have to tell me, but I want to ask the following questions. And then the question is, what happens when you refuse to answer? And what does the firm assume about you? And if they assume the worst because you refuse to answer, like they say, you don't have to tell me if you're an alcoholic and steal on the job, but I just would like to know. And then if you say no, and they say, okay, I assume everybody who says no is an alcoholic, the fact that you can remain silent is completely worthless. So I think ownership by itself is not good enough. If you're really going to try to go down that road for privacy, you actually have to ban people from even voluntarily giving the information. All right, so I will stop there, even though I have brilliant summary conclusions.
Thank you, Michael. I actually had one question. I was a little confused by the very sharp distinction you made in the earlier part of your talk between below-cost pricing. Well, below-cost pricing being pro-competitive because you're investing in getting more data and users, and being anti-competitive because you're depriving your rival of doing the same. But it seems both occur simultaneously, don't they?
Yep.
So
that's why it's that's why I think at the end somewhere it says, thank you for the segue in this slide. Take exclusion seriously, but tread carefully. It's a really hard problem,
right.
Because it is going to be you're going to see elements of both. And so, for example, those who are into it, thinking about what the but-for world is and the counterfactual is really difficult. But can, at least in theory, try something like saying, okay, look, you charge this price, but what if we assumed, and again, it's a counterfactual, that yes, you got the extra users, but it didn't have any effect on your rivals' users, which obviously couldn't really happen. Right. Would it have been profitable in that world? And if the answer is no, then you could go down this road.
Okay. Diana?
Well, thanks, Tom. Thanks to the Institute for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here amongst colleagues and a terrific set of participants. I want to talk about three major points. I want to try and put this debate over digital markets. I call them digital markets. I don't call them platforms. Within a context, broader context of what's going on in antitrust and competition policy. Then I'd like to sort of hone in on some comments about the challenges of defining digital markets within an antitrust frame. And then I, too, would like to add some thoughts on big data and what it portends for antitrust analysis. So, as you all know, we're in the middle of a pretty robust debate about the importance of competition enforcement, competition policy. That debate has extended the spectrum from left to right in terms of your ideology. We used to have sort of the progressives and the conservatives. Now we have populists, progressives, and conservatives stretched across the spectrum. So populist ideology, they get some credit for sort of getting everybody revved up to think differently about antitrust and think more expansively. They are, as far as I can tell, are exploring really basic issues about the role of antitrust, controlling political power. I don't think antitrust is about controlling political power. It's about controlling economic power and indirectly gets at political issues. We've heard about regulating digital markets and the platforms. We've heard about taxing digital market players, sort of a foregone conclusion that they are monopolies. There's an uber focus on monopoly, this sort of anti-monopoly movement, but antitrust does include two other important areas of enforcement, cartels and merger control. We've heard general complaints about market power and the exercise of market power, but no specific complaints that would sort of pass muster under an antitrust framework. What is the theory of harm? How are rivals being excluded? How are consumers being harmed? And we've also heard about antitrust as sort of the sole proprietor of correcting, what ails us today in the digital market, spaces. Conservative ideology, I think, goes the other way. May advocate for how antitrust really doesn't apply in the digital market spaces. We've got fast-paced innovation. We have antitrust, thus must forbear from interventions. There are a lot of efficiencies to be gained. We have zero-price markets, so there's no real exchange or metric of commerce. Not really within the realm of antitrust, would be a heavy lift for antitrust to get at. I don't agree with that. The middle or the progressive view is, I think, where we should all be. And that view really is that the antitrust laws are durable and they're flexible. The consumer welfare standard is adequate in addressing all related effects: price, non-price dimensions of competition, quality, service variety, innovation. So the consumer welfare standard is fine, and it can handle the digital markets. But we need to really get a constructive dialogue going. It's not a well-grounded debate at this stage in time, and we need to ground it if antitrust is going to play an important role. And that means actively educating not only the public, but enforcers, judges, policymakers about how antitrust can apply in these spaces. And I would just note for the record that antitrust has taken on what were then very sort of on the fringe frontier-like cases. Microsoft, that was a frontier case way back when. Google ITA, potential competition, that was a frontier case. Recently, Tokyo Electron, Applied Materials, that was all about innovation. Kudos to the DOJ for taking on innovation markets. All right, so moving on to challenges of defining digital markets, because eventually antitrust will have to do this. I think there are some obstacles that need to be overcome. The traditional transactional framework is a bit strained when you talk about digital markets. Remember, platforms are really fundamentally about a value proposition. They're not about products and services being closely, clearly defined and traded. It's about creating value, right? There are very high levels of interconnectivity in the digital markets. There's integration of all types and forms by contract or by ownership. There's a tremendous amount of complementarity where you have single interfaces in place for multi-use services such as, calendars and maps, advertising and content usage. And then you've got suppliers who are sometimes competing with each other, but then sometimes they complement each other. So these are, admittedly very complex markets. So these are not your standard bilateral or even multilateral transactions. They are really ecosystems of exchanges, of exchanges and collaboration to produce these very highly linked sets of services. And it's not a static environment. And this is where antitrust traditionally has, been reluctant to intervene. You've got evolving businesses in the digital markets where they're adding new businesses, often in complementary relationships. There are self-learning algorithms, right? So we have machine learning now, which is proving to be a challenge. Social networking sites, payment systems, and then of course there are the network effects and the potential tipping to a single standard or a single set of digital markets. So, what is the metric of commerce and exchange? That's another challenge I think that antitrust has to take on. Well, we know that there are many lines of commerce, in the traditional framework. There's exchange, cloud services, content, intelligent home and connectivity services, mobility services, advertising, geolocation services, communications. So there's many potential lines of commerce. Those don't necessarily make up relevant markets within the antitrust frame. So we've got advertising, which is sort of more traditional as a possible market, right, where pricing and quality is important. But we have this whole other notion of the consumer not engaging in any sort of price-related exchange. That's not the currency of the digital markets. The currency of the digital markets is a willingness to provide information or a willingness to attend, to provide attention or give attention. So, it's not willingness to pay. So, antitrust is going to have to change the frame away from looking at willingness to pay and really embrace zero-price markets that nonetheless do have a metric of exchange, willingness to inform, willingness to intend. All right, and consumers reveal their preferences, absolutely. So those of you who opt out of providing your personal information when you go to the United Airlines website are opting out of getting potentially higher valued bundled services or other offers that might be beneficial to you. So there is a way for consumers to participate in this system. All right, so relevant markets. Let's drill down even more to the relevant market issue. The digital markets is where consumers go to get information. Basically, they go for search, for news, for shopping. They go to socialize. I too am not on Facebook because I can't keep track of everything, and I'm the ridicule of my family and friends for not being on it. Consumers go there to organize their lives, right? But all these digital market platforms or clusters, if you will, furnish services with slightly different functionalities to meet different consumer demands, right? And so they're differentiated. These are really differentiated clustered markets. Amazon specializes in merchants, logistics. You go to buy. Google is really about machine learning and improving search algorithms. Apple is all about integration, right, within their ecosystem. Facebook is all about connectivity. So these are all ways to get information and for consumers to go, but they are slightly different. So I think it fits well within a differentiated products model. But it also makes it very difficult to define markets around these clusters where there are sets of highly complementary products and services or functionality, and they're just slightly different. So from a traditional market definition standpoint, that can be a challenge. And you also have a large variety of users and customer classes, which of course opens up the doors for potential forms of price discrimination. So just finishing up on the critical role of data, I've got to really agree with a lot of what Professor Katz has said. And I think we're going to see much more on the role of data. For the platforms or the digital markets, the key is to harness data. There are new data analytic capabilities. But with the caveat that what the Fortune 1000 or 500 companies think they're doing with data or the value they're getting out of data isn't so aligned with how the antitrust community might be thinking about data. So I just pulled an article out of the Harvard Business Review from over the summer. Analytics, how companies really use big data. And so they interviewed all these CEOs about how their companies are using data. For companies that have initiatives in place and are starting to realize returns on those initiatives, the biggest percentage of CEOs, the largest percentage of sites for the use of big data is to decrease expenses, right? It's for cost cutting. The second largest grouping was to find new innovation avenues. And it went on from there, down to launching new products or services, adding revenue, transforming businesses, establishing a data-driven culture. So all I'm saying is what's going on in reality in terms of how companies are using big data isn't necessarily synced up or aligned with how the antitrust community is thinking about it. All right, so all of this artificial intelligence, machine learning has increased the value of data. Data used in one gathering or serving one service, online service, can be leveraged or used to enhance another in targeting audiences and elaborating on their demands. It's easy to collect, and the new processing technologies make it very actionable, and that tends to increase value of the platforms. There's also the notion that you need a lot of technological coordination to fuse these data sets together, right? There are data sets all over the place. They have to be fused together. There are a lot of economies of scale, scope, and I would add coordination on data. And so, we're going to have to look at how data is procured. Is it through contract, arm's length transactions? Is it through integration? And what are the technologies that allow firms to fuse these data sets together? Because that, I'm sure, will be part of an antitrust case at some point somewhere. And of course, the platforms can design incentives to induce users to actively provide data or to even passively provide their data. And I think this is where the privacy issues come up. So as far as the role of big data and analytics, antitrust analytics, data is not a consumer protection issue exclusively anymore. It has been for a long time. It is also not exclusively a competition issue. It is absolutely a nexus issue, an intersection issue. So yes, there are fundamental consumer protection issues about data around privacy, but it absolutely fits within the frame of competition. So, for example, data could be a relevant market. The problem here is we have to be more specific about what kind of data we're talking about. If you talk to the platforms, they'll tell you this. They'll say, well, we have all this different types of data. It's used for different things. It has different functionalities. So there has to be some specificity, as there would be in any market definition effort, to figure out exactly what this data is doing. So data can be a relevant market. It can also be a theory of harm. Right? It can be part of a theory of harm. Using data, for example, as a way to foreclose rivals, so cutting off access to inputs potentially through vertical mergers or vertical restraints. It could be a barrier to entry. If you defined a market around data, if you created a larger data player, that could absolutely be a barrier to entry. So data can fit within the rubric, the traditional rubric of antitrust analytics is a theory of harm. And it can also be an adverse effect or an outcome of a particular type of anti-competitive conduct or a merger. And that's where data really is about a quality issue. That's how I think it enters the calculus, as quality. Firms compete on price, they also compete on quality. If one platform decides to compete more aggressively on quality, they can say, look, we'll keep your data more secure, you don't worry about cybersecurity, it's a quality issue. And we have evidence of that. Bing, for example, was advertising very much so the role of quality. So just summing up the implications of all this, we have a great debate going. I'm sure there's a lot more to be said. We need enforcers and courts and policymakers to become more educated. I think everyone in this room is going to play an important role in that. but cognizant of the flexibility of the existing laws and the consumer welfare standard. And then I would say that this debate will benefit greatly from a multidisciplinary approach. It's not just law and economics. This is really one of those things, and AAI has done a lot of work in multidisciplinary analysis. We need the business schools involved, strategic management, we need marketing, we need folks who know about contract theory, complexity, innovation management. These are all disciplines that are going to help inform this debate as it moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Josh?
Sure. So I think Diana and Michael sort of nailed all of the big data stuff, so I'm going to circle back to platform sort of at the end of what I do, end of my remarks, in part because I think the push to do more antitrust things in big data with platforms in digital markets is at least in part an effect of a broader movement to attack the consumer welfare standard, some of which Diana's remarks focused on. I think the only part I took minor and only semantic issue with in Diana's remarks was the description of the right and the left in this middle view that says, do the consumer welfare standard, get your hands dirty with the economics. Sign me up anywhere. I'll call it the conservative view, she'll call it the progressive one, but we'll say the same thing and sort of fight over the label. But I think it does give a sense of how strong the consensus is within the industrial organization, economics, antitrust community about the benefits of the consumer welfare standard. And I want to talk a little bit about that because this debate sort of doesn't come out of nowhere. I looked, I am not on the Facebook, but I am on the Twitter. And 6 months ago or so, I was reading my email in the morning, and my mother, who knows nothing about what I do for a living or antitrust or anything like that, I have a PhD in economics, she thinks I'm an accountant, it's fine. I got an email from my mother, it has the word antitrust, she sends it to me, Senator Klobuchar has something saying we're gonna make antitrust cool again. And my mom says, you should read this because it's something to do with your life. And so I looked, and I sometimes tell my law students that antitrust is in fact cool. They groan, they mostly groan. But I read it and I said, whatever could Senator Klobuchar mean in the attempt to make antitrust cool again? And she meant some series of the following things. Drop the consumer welfare standard, presume that large mergers are illegal regardless of their effect on consumers, outright ban vertical mergers, introduce income inequality into the consumer welfare standard, and also jobs, and some other things. And so it turned out that the argument or the claim for making antitrust cool again was make antitrust 1950s again, in terms of the evolution of the doctrine. And too much of what, and then from there you've got hipster antitrust speeches and you've got all sorts of things happening, but not a lot of discussion about why antitrust sort of ultimately rejected that approach and landed on the consumer welfare standard, and a little bit of, I think, myth and fallacy surrounding what the consumer welfare standard is and is not. And so I want to sort of start there because I think it's where all the action is and the larger debate, and maybe come back to platforms at the end. I mean, the underlying premise of the demand to make antitrust cool again and to reject the consumer welfare standard, I think, comes from populist sort of motives and motivation, no doubt. The intellectual support for those moves really comes sort of from that underlying premise that the consumer welfare standard is failing in some important way. It is, there's a mass increase in market power and consumers are worse off. There's some actions that the agency should be taking but are not because the law is constraining them in some way. I think that's sort of premise one. And so, and I think maybe the implicit, sometimes explicit, in arguments that I've seen is that the agencies are in some way asleep behind the wheel, sort of not willing to bring cases. I think both of those are dead wrong. To the extent they can be wrong on theory, evidence, and other dimensions, they're wrong on all the dimensions that they can possibly be wrong on. And so I want to talk about that mostly. And sort of land on platforms. The primary piece of evidence economic evidence in any event that we've had a large increase in market power. And this isn't a place to go through a lit review, but the primary piece of evidence is a CEA, Council of Economic Advisors report that came out of the White House and the Obama administration by Jason Furman, who's an excellent, excellent economist who did excellent work in the CEA, that counts up some data and says something like, they measure something called the C50. I went to graduate school in the late 90s and early 2000s. I did not learn about the C50. It turns out, I think even if you got your PhD in economics 20 or 30 years earlier, you probably never heard of a C50. In fact, if you do a literature search in all of the economics journals you can find in the last 100 years, there's no such thing as a C50. We talk sometimes about C4s and C8s. That means sum up the shares of the top 4 or top 8 firms, right? C50 is obviously not a difficult generalization of that. But what they do is they say, let's count the number of industries at a very broad level, like stuff made with metal. And we're not talking about antitrust markets, right? We're talking about really, really broad markets. We're not measuring competition in these markets, but just sort of as a rough cut. In how many industries is the C50 above 30? So do your sort of quick math on your device that you've got. It means the number of industries in which the average share of the top 50 firms is about 1.6%. Hint to you, if you can count 50 firms in the industry, you may not have a competition problem. Hint number 2, if the average share is below 2%, you also may not have a competition problem. Now that number does go up, but it turns out it mostly goes up because of telecom, right, and other regulated industry shares going up. So if you take that away, even that bit goes away. Anyway, in terms of starting an antitrust revolution, not the strongest piece of evidence. In fact, I would argue sort of mostly irrelevant to the questions we should be interested in. Are the agencies asleep behind the wheel? Sort of sometimes pointed to we point the number of cases that the agencies bring. My own view, having sort of been in the agency at the FTC and maybe being the guy sort of most skeptical of agency cases, I voted on 90% of what we did. I think the evidence on that front is pretty weak as well. Sort of 2 examples that come to mind out of the agency where I served. Nielsen Arbitron, agency settled a case. A gun-shy agency does not bring an enforcement action arguing that a merger between firms is unlawful on the grounds that it might later, right? The theory in the case was the relevant market was a product that neither produced today. That one day, both of these firms, not one, both of these firms would enter this market, and if they did, they would compete. And if they did, and if they competed, the merger would then be anti-competitive. I voted no because I think the theory is ludicrous, right? The theory is that we're stopping competition, sort of minority report antitrust, right? We're stopping competition that might happen later. But the agency brought that case. It was a dissent I had, right? Agency brought the case. There's a settlement. FanDuel, DraftKings, I was gone. Right? 2 firms, these are platforms, digital market stuff, right? 2 firms that had been in the red their entire existence, right? The agency challenged the merger successfully. The firms dropped it. Hold aside the debate over the merits of the case, but these are aggressive actions to bring, all right? Merger enforcement action against firms that are in the red. So in the red is not monopoly profit if you're keeping a score at home. So maybe good actions, maybe not, but certainly not conservative or gun shy or asleep behind the wheel is sort of the main point. I sort of reject the premise of the overall movement for both of those reasons. But perhaps the most important reason is because of what the consumer welfare standard sort of actually is. It can be difficult to implement in exclusion cases of the type that Michael talked about, or involving trade-offs with data and sort of the types of things that both Michael and Diana were talking about. But when we talk about what the consumer welfare standard is and is not in antitrust, too often, I think, in modern discussions that are increasingly important for exactly the reason that Diana said, education on these issues is incredibly important. The consumer welfare standard moves over time. It's meant to. It's linked to the economics literature. So as we learn more, if you go back to the 1940s to 60s, the era where we are going to sort of make antitrust cool again, vertical mergers, tying, RPM, exclusive dealing, name a thing that you would like to do if you are a firm, and it is illegal. And it is illegal largely on the view that the economics literature at the time was suspicious of most of these activities. So we've learned some stuff since then. We've learned things ranging from the effects of vertical mergers, horizontal mergers, tying, resale price maintenance, and those things get reflected in the law. Sometimes in ways that make us more skeptical of claims, sometimes the other direction. What the agencies are doing now in exclusion claims, in investigating and exclusion, sort of using input foreclosure and raising rivals cost economics developed sort of far later, is way more sophisticated than anything they were doing in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. And so the consumer welfare standard adjusts over time, as it should, to economic learning. Now, I raised that point for sort of two reasons. One, the idea that people refer to the consumer welfare standard as a thing. It's the law being applied rather than sort of a methodological commitment of the law is a mistake. And it's a mistake that casts what the antitrust enterprise is as sort of a static thing that can't move. And of course, if there's a static thing that can't move, you must change it from time to time. But that's not what it is. It's a methodological commitment that is, for better or worse, tied to economics, tied to economic methodology. I would argue there are certainly costs of that tethering, but the benefits far exceed the cost on the margin. Let me end with, I promised I would turn to platforms at some point, so let me do that now. Supreme Court granted certain amex. I think this is an incredibly important case for the manner in which antitrust law, in particular Section 1, will develop to handle platform cases. You've got potentially a couple of really big issues at play. One is how we think about market power in the platform context, right? We generally think of market power as sort of a required showing in vertical cases. That issue and how we think about both measuring and sort of diagnosing market power in cases involving platforms, that is sort of up for grabs in that case, and I think remarkably important. I think the second issue there that is remarkably important and will have a big impact on what the law enforcement agencies do with respect to antitrust claims in the platform context is how we think about harms on one side or the other. I think most people expect the Supreme Court to at least talk about in the case is the idea, how important is it in an antitrust case if I show harm on one side and not the other, right? Most economists in the room would say, I think, we could argue about where to put the burdens or how high to make the burdens of proof on the parties, but would think probably at some level you want to think about the effects on all the sides to get the answer right. What is up for grabs in that case is can I dispel the plaintiff's prima facie burden by showing harm on one side when I know there's effects on the other side? That is an incredibly important doctrinal issue for the Supreme Court to handle if and when they get there that I think will have really important implications for platform cases, both for the agencies and, of course, the private plaintiffs who can bring those cases. I will stop there.
Thanks. And Larry's task is multifaceted. He's supposed to discuss these papers and present his own views. And
thank you, Tom. I'm going to be as you're going to see, going to be wearing two hats this morning. On the one hand, as Tom just said, I have the responsibility for discussing the three presentations that I had absolutely no advance opportunity to see Michael's slides because he told me they were completed at 10 a.m. this morning. Am I right? Did I miss?
That's why I stayed across the street.
Yeah, there you go. And I hadn't exchanged any emails with Diana or with Josh. So this is all on the fly. However, I decided, gee, just in case I wouldn't have enough to say, I prepared some slides of my own, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. And as you're going to see, and truly, I had not communicated with any of them, many of the things I'm going to talk about in my slides are going to reinforce some of the things you heard. But let me my first hat, just talk about a few of the things that I heard from each of the speakers and try to emphasize and elaborate a little bit. The first, Michael raised the issue of what is a platform and it's ill-defined, and I would reinforce that. And given the characteristics, ask yourself, is your local supermarket a platform? And, we didn't traditionally think of the local supermarket as a platform. It was a place that bought stuff wholesale and sold it to consumers retail. But as you start to think about how we think about a platform and the interconnections, the economies of scale, the economies of scope, the network externalities, you could start telling a story that your local supermarket is a platform. And especially nowadays that the local supermarket is collecting data from your transactions, either through the credit card or through your use of a loyalty card. A lot of the stuff we tell about Amazon, we could equally tell about Giant or Safeway or Kroger or Acme or wherever. So keep that in mind. Experience effects. At the very end, Michael did use the words learning by doing or learning curve. But if you think about this experience effect, it's exactly what we were talking about in the 1980s as learning curve effects or learning by doing. And shortly after I arrived at the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice in 1982, I had lobbyist after lobbyist coming in and trying to explain to me learning curves and the fact that they might want to price below cost somehow measured early on so as to gain the experience, and they hoped this wasn't going to be considered predatory. Apparently, they hadn't realized that Bill Baxter was then the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, and there was no way Bill was ever going to bring a case like that. But, certainly the experience stuff, it's just the learning curve all over again. No economic sense idea that Michael mentioned. I'm surprised it hasn't been picked up more. Doug Melamed wrote about it, Greg Werden has written about it, but somehow the idea, judging this sort of activity of pricing a certain way, if the only reason it makes sense is to do in your rival, the equivalent of planting dynamite next to the walls of your rival's factory. If that's the only way that this makes sense, gee, that may be a problem. Now, of course, there's going to be fuzzy areas, but the no economic sense, I think, makes a lot of sense. With Diana's comments, I would just say that, she's describing difficult to define markets. At the end of the day, we've got to find a way to define them, but they are going to be difficult. As you're going to see, that's a point I'm going to come back to in my slides. Data may well fit into antitrust markets, but we're really going to have to work hard to figure out how to define those markets. All right, with Josh, he mentioned that CEA report of a year and a half ago, and yes, the first thing I noticed was they were talking about 50 firm concentration ratios, and again, as you're going to see, that's going to come up in my slides. He mentioned briefly, I'm sorry he didn't spend more time on it, that sometimes commentators look at the number of cases brought by enforcement agencies and use that as a measure of the strictness of enforcement, and that is absolutely the wrong measure to be using. You could imagine terrifically tight enforcement, and no cases get brought because everybody knows the rules. The potential criminals are too scared to go out and commit crimes, or no cases get brought because there's no enforcement. Just by looking at the number of cases brought, you can't tell the difference. And also, if you believed in a cases brought is equivalent to strictness of enforcement, then you must not believe in deterrence. Believing in deterrence is a disbelief in that particular measure. I share with Josh the belief that Amex is going to be an important case. All right, so now, Tom, you'll indulge me a little bit. I'll try to be quick. I understand, but I gotta say what I gotta say.
You're going to go through that whole thing?
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah. So I have. All right. Let me see if I can get out of here. There we are. Okay. So why?
You have to use this thing in the middle, the pointer in the middle of the keyboard.
This thing?
In the middle of the keyboard itself.
Oh, this guy.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. All right. Come on. There we go. All right. So, how could I not quote from Shakespeare? And also, as a business school professor, how can I not tell you what I'm going to say it, and then tell you what I said? But also, as anybody who's ever been with me in a presentation knows, I like to hand out hard copy of everything I say, and as a good microeconomist, supply will exceed demand. Please pass all this stuff to that. All right, so there's been a lot of attention to these particular, well, all right, you've seen this. So a lot of attention, and I just grabbed off my shelf a whole bunch of articles that apply to these various topics. By the way, let me, show of hands, how many people have actually read Lena Khan's article? Let me see, how many? All right, not many. Let me urge, it's a 95-page article in the Yale Law Journal. It won't take you very long, maybe 15, 20 minutes. Trust me, okay? There's this focus, but this inchoate concern about the power of the rising companies. Then, Josh, let's see. I didn't hand out copies. Are there any extra copies? I should give them to my platform mates. Do you have any extras? Any extras? All right, here we go. And there's surplus over here. So the CEA study. Josh mentioned it. Notice I'm putting the words market in quotation marks because that turns out to be a crucial thing. So these are the kinds of concerns that have been raised. One of the things I've been doing over the last few months, I wrote a paper with at the time, an undergraduate at the Stern School of Business. He's now doing a master's at Columbia University. Boyan Jasper Yang. You're going to be hearing a lot more about this young man. Is to look at aggregate concentration. What percentage of overall private sector employment is accounted for by the largest 500 firms, like the Fortune 500, like the Forbes 500, like the Census Bureau has done special compilations. And what you can see here, and again, it's reproduced in what you have, is there was a substantial fall in aggregate concentration from the early 1980s into the mid-90s, and since then, a very modest rise, only a modest rise. So, the notion the big companies are taking over everything, it sure ain't reflected in employment data. Neither is it reflected in profits data. And Steve Salop and a former student of his, I forget what Igul's first name is, have done a similar type of compilation using market capitalization. Essentially all publicly traded firms, what percentage is accounted for, in their case, the largest 20, the largest 50, the largest 100. What do you see? It's flat. You don't see this sort of substantial rise. Now this is at the aggregate level. It doesn't tell you anything about antitrust, about competition, but it may tell you something about these social concerns. Now, on the other hand, do these data reflect, the importance of Facebook, which has come up a couple of times, or Twitter, or Amazon, or Google? I don't know, but that's hard to measure. All right, what about market definition? If we're going to be worried about the exercise of market power, we need to delineate relevant markets. Since 1982, I'll take partial credit for that. The horizontal merger guidelines have done a pretty good job, and they've been substantially improved over the last 35 years or so of applying a set of principles to delineate markets for mergers. And they are also applicable, as Greg Weirton has pointed out, to prospective monopolization issues, but they are not applicable to the standard monopolization or exclusionary problem where there's an allegation an existing dominant firm is in the position to exercise market power. And there unfortunately is no available paradigm that is widely accepted and will help us. I proposed one 10, 15 years ago. It hasn't been picked up. What can I say? What about all those studies that, and there have been, and, again, here they are. Studies that try to use market concentration to explain profit rates. And we, in the I/O area, gave that up 30 years ago. We decided that partly those profit rates were too much noise, too much variability, too much accounting noise in them. We substituted prices for profit rates, and I think we've done a good job there. If you'll notice those current studies, a lot of them are done by finance guys because the finance profession didn't get the message 30 years ago, and they still think that running these kinds of regressions are worthwhile. None of these studies spend any time worrying about relevant markets and whether 4-digit SIC or NAICS markets really are relevant for these kinds of efforts. And again, sometimes they use a Herfindahl or a 4-firm concentration ratio, but sometimes they'll use 8 or 20 or even 50. Not very interesting. What about income distribution? Antitrust is largely irrelevant for income distribution issues. Yes, more vigorous competition is going to mean smaller monopoly or profits or rents, but this is at best a small second order, maybe even third order effect. And I see these, and Tim, you will remember from the 1970s the efforts to whip inflation now, and this has exactly that same flavor to it. I think I should have also, looking at these slides this morning, should have added a slide. What about the entry of small businesses, and is the monopolization? Can antitrust do anything about the slowdown in the creation of small businesses? Unlikely. Second order at best. All right, so where should antitrust policy be going? Keep a consumer, or you want to call it a total welfare standard. Anything else is going to lead to a morass, and we don't want to be there. I believe in vigorous merger enforcement. My good friend, colleague, co-author John Quokka's study, I think, is solid. I know there are critics. I've read John's stuff that recent enforcement has been too lax. He's not the only. There have been other very respectable econometric studies that have shown the same. Stay away from behavioral remedies. Favor structural remedies, but do remember when we're dealing with structural remedies, the divestiture, the issue of who is a suitable buyer is a terrifically important one, because the interests of the enforcer and the interests of the firm that is spinning off the entity are not consistent. The spinner-offer wants a weak buyer, the enforcer wants a strong buyer. And so there's a real problem there. Be open to claims of exclusionary practices, but again, we've got to develop a better paradigm for trying to figure out when a firm really does have market power. Again, I should have included an additional slide. Where should antitrust policy not be going? Well, it's all those other areas, focusing on income distribution, the 1950s antitrust that Josh mentioned. That's where we should not be going. And so, in conclusion, it's a good time to be an antitrust economist. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I have questions of my own, but we have a lot of people in the audience who know a lot about these issues, so I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. And we have microphones. If you could identify yourself and any affiliation when you ask your question, that'd be great.
Carl Zabel with NetChoice. Lawrence, I think you brought up a really good point at the end about how antitrust has become this empty vessel that everyone's pouring all their frustrations and complaints about every social issue into. But one of the things that Josh brought up was talking about the other side of antitrust, the benefits of the antitrust. Can you kind of talk about the benefits to small businesses of these platforms that have economies of scale, and how small businesses are actually able to find new customers and new opportunities?
Was that addressed to me?
To whomever.
Well, all right, let me start with Lena Khan's article, and she will tell you oh, you got to read it. You got to read it, because she'll tell you that, it's really a shame that all those small businesses need to rely on Amazon, who's going to collect data from in the background, Look, it's like many things. It's a two-edged sword. There aren't going to be neutral platforms out there. They're choosing it because it's the best alternative for them. And, until we see some specific exclusionary anti-competitive practice on the part of an Amazon or other type of platform entities, I don't see it's an opportunity as well as a risk. But most things in life are like that.
If you could wait for the microphone. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm Cecile Coors with TIG Advisors. As a former colleague of Josh's at the FTC, I'm very sympathetic to your viewpoint. I guess I'm concerned, though, that litigation hasn't quite kept pace with the economics. The mantra still seems to be cite Vons and Philadelphia National Bank, and you'll be fine. And I mean, what do you say in response to that? Because that is that case is cited in every single case the government wins.
So I've said a lot about that. So I will say what I have said. I wish I had papers to wave. I can borrow one and just claim it's mine.
Here. Lena.
Read what I wrote about Philadelphia National Bank. That's,
You got to bring props.
Maybe.
You got to bring props in the future.
I'm learning from you, Larry. I'm slow. So let me talk about it. This is one of my favorite hobby horses when I was at the FTC. FTC doesn't cite Vaughn's Grocery anymore, not on anything that I voted on. But they do cite PNB. They do cite PNB plenty. which is sort of for those in the audience not familiar, a merger case that gives a presumption of illegality of a merger upon a showing that the post-merger share is above 35%, right? And so that level is far below the percentage at which sort of the agencies would more generally challenge cases. So they get to shift the burden sort of before the case starts in most of these cases. I think the view that, I think if you were to line up, maybe someone will disagree with this notion, but I think if you were to line up 100 IO economists and say, all you know about a merger is that the post-merger share is 35%, is it more likely to raise prices or lower them? Or do you agree it's more likely to increase prices? I think you'd get an overwhelming majority to say no, that doesn't make a lot of economic sense. But the agencies will oftentimes, and I want to separate something out, so I'm going to sort of defend the agencies and then criticize them in two separate breaths, but I think it's actually the right answer. The agencies, when they analyze mergers inside, they decide whether or not to bring a case, are not relying on P&B. They're doing real economic work and figuring out, do I think this thing is going to raise prices or not? Do I think it's going to reduce innovation? Do I think it's going to harm consumers or not? And sometimes the answer to that question is yes. My favorite example, there was a hospital merger case in Idaho, St. Luke's, for those sort of follow the antitrust game or hospital mergers. The work that the Bureau of Economics economist and our expert did in that case, and the work that the healthcare and hospital economists do at the FTC in general, is really cutting edge, cool stuff. It's an area where there's a lot of data. They can do a lot of really neat things. They did them. Certainly convinced me to vote to block the merger, and got to court, and none of that stuff ever showed up. They got to court and they said, P&B gives us a presumption, we win, thank you. All right, and they won. And this is, I think, a problem with what happens to mergers when they get to court. I want to sort of separate out the way that the agencies analyze them, but this really matters. 99% of what the agencies do are settlements. So if I have a credible threat that, look, it's a close call, but I can invoke the presumption, shift the burden, and by the way, the number of firms that have ever come back in federal court from that burden shifting, you can count on less than one hand, and you can't argue it is zero. So it's a big deal to shift the burden. And that means firms on the margin are a little bit more likely to settle in close cases or even cases where they think they would otherwise win. I think this is a problem. If I were to rank order cases, I think the Supreme Court ought to Amex ain't top 5 on the list. It's a really important case, but the P&B presumption, because it impacts so much of what we do in mergers, is a really big deal. But what the agencies are doing inside is miles ahead of that. I think sort of once we get over sort of rejecting the view that antitrust should go back to the 50s, I think there are important questions to turn to next, including aligning agency practice with what happens in the law.
Can I just add a quick comment? One way to look at the P&B issue is, aren't we living it right now? Aren't we living the implications of Philadelphia National Bank right now? I mean, look at the late Obama-era cases at the DOJ and at least one or two at the FTC. I mean, the health insurance mergers, high levels of concentration in those markets, whether it's Medicare Advantage or whether it's commercial insurance. Cisco US Foods, almost a monopoly in broadline food service, national broadline food service. Baker Hughes Halliburton was not litigated. The others were, but not litigated. The companies abandoned in the face of very strong opposition from the government. I mean, those were presumptively anti-competitive mergers because they were occurring in markets with very, very few market players. I mean, read the complaints. There's one-liners on efficiencies. There are no countervailing efficiencies. Another one-liner on entry. Entry is difficult and will not serve to discipline price increases post-merger. So I would just cite, I think Josh raises some good points, but I would just cite to the cases, we're getting a number of cases lining up here that, supports the implications of Philadelphia National Bank.
Because we should disagree on one thing on any panel we sit on, let me do one. which is if your case, the stronger your case, and I think the point of you raising those cases, these are really strong cases, the stronger your case, the less you need the darn presumption. And the presumption kicks in at 30. Those are mergers that's, much higher. And the rest of the trend in IO economics has been the 2010 guidelines. The big thing they do is say economists are pretty nervous about market definition, right? Sort of deciding what's in and out, especially in the area of platforms and digital markets, pretending we are drawing really precise lines so we can count the number of firms with our fingers and count their shares and stuff and draw implications, increasingly makes economists nervous. I think that anxiety is reflected in the move in the guidelines. There is tension here, is all I'm saying, between relying on shares to do those presumptions. Some presumption doesn't make me nervous. Setting it at 30 in a world where in practical litigation a defendant never comes back from that. And the argument is, and this was the argument made against me at the FTC when I said, can we stop citing PNB? And everyone said no, but tried, was, Josh, name a case where all we had was the PNB presumption, where we won because of it. I think that argument cuts the other way. If you don't need it, what we are doing as public enforcement agencies with taxpayer money, one of our jobs is to educate federal courts on things that are true about economics. That's antitrust hard. In educating people on how to do economics. We're not at the agency's private plaintiffs where all we're getting paid to do is win the cases and defend our clients. One of our jobs is to educate the courts. And what we do every time we cite PNB is we say, hey, Article 3 judge, it is true that a post-merger share above 30 makes it more likely than not that a merger is anti-competitive. That is a statement the agency knows it is untrue, and it cites the cases telling judges it is. As a litigation strategy, I get it. I also don't care. I think we go in with real economic evidence. If the judges don't understand real economic evidence, and we got to teach them what a standard error is. Well, let's teach them what a standard error is then, and bring real economic evidence that we're capable of producing and win the cases. I get there are trade-offs. It might mean we lose some cases where the merger is in fact anti-competitive. I get that. I wouldn't quarrel with that at all. But I think for a public enforcement agency, that educational part of the mission is part of what we do. It's part of the reason we have guidelines.
Can I just say one thing about it? And this is not necessarily defending the presumption, but I think the correct answer, if you asked 100 IO economists, do you know if the merger, if it's 30, 35% or more or less likely to raise price? The correct answer is they don't know, because you have to say what the market definition is, and that's a slippery thing. Arguably, you would define it, if you defined the market definition properly, the merger would always be to a monopoly, because if the two firms could raise the price, you could say, okay, well then they should have been a monopoly. So I think we don't know that, and then once you start having differentiated products, and also just, we know the models tell us in the absence of efficiencies, merging to 5% shares could raise price. It's a question of how much. So I think the correct answer is we really don't know. Now, that doesn't undermine your point about how much should we rely on the presumption.
Yeah, it makes it, because the presumption is saying we do know.
I'll get you next.
The EU has taken a far more aggressive approach to both privacy and data protection than the United States has, and recently, at least partially in pursuit of their single digital market strategy, at least that part of it, which is aimed at competition with the United States, they're also taking a much more aggressive antitrust approach, particularly to some of the American companies likely to be the platforms that we're looking at here. How influential, if at all, do you think that's going to be with respect to the U.S. approach to antitrust law?
Well, I'm happy to chime in on that one. I think that is a very relevant and happening debate right now. But I think to understand, and Europe, the European Commission and Europe in general is being cited as sort of the standard for how antitrust should work going forward. But I think to unpack that, you're dealing with some very different cultural differences in Europe versus in the United States, different economic systems, more of a socialist-based system versus a free enterprise capitalist system. Europe has gone so far as to legislate policies, social policies on privacy. That's not been the approach in the United States, and certainly there is an interest now, a very a robust interest in that. We've left privacy pretty much to private incentives, which I think that's a really compelling reason why antitrust can and should take on privacy as a quality issue in competition and also as a sort of a strategic asset issue. If we're not going to legislate rules on privacy and consumer data, then we definitely need a system that, an antitrust framework that can consider privacy as a strategic asset or as a quality issue. So that's one avenue for sort of addressing the privacy concerns. But the cultural differences are vast, and the laws are slightly different. On Section 2, Europe has a very different approach than we do. I always remind people, however, that on cartel enforcement and on merger control, there's a tremendous amount of compatibility and cooperation across borders to address those areas of enforcement.
But there's nothing that, privacy as a quality issue that you compete on, there's nothing that prevents the authorities from taking that into account now, right?
I don't think there is, and we're encouraging antitrust enforcers to look at it as a quality issue within the competition
It's
framework.
just that most firms don't find it profitable to compete on that dimension, right?
I think it would be a mistake to say that the agencies don't ever think about that when doing antitrust review.
Alden, could we have, yeah.
One thing noted about as it's hipster antitrust say, well, there's problems with small business formation, stagnant economy. It must be lack of antitrust. To paraphrase not Shakespeare but Madison, if men were angels, you wouldn't need government. Well, unfortunately, angels are not in government, and with the best of intentions or not, depends upon your view of public choice. And there's been a lot of work, applied micro work, on the cost of regulation. Huge impact on incentives to create small businesses. There's been a new occupational licensing, barriers to entry. And this is something IO economists could look at, and it seems to me, you can't defend yourself without pointing out the real cause of the problem. In my view, a lot of the problem is stagnation. You can point to overregulation, which has grown like topsy. And yet you hear very, very little said about that publicly. As to antitrust and other...
Come on, Alden. Even that CEA in 2016 brought out a strong report that said there was way too much occupational licensing.
I guess, Larry, I'm talking about the popular press, The Economist. I read The Economist every week, and it keeps bemoaning lack of antitrust enforcement. But it has and it makes some passing reference, there may be some regulatory problems, but there seems to be in the popular discourse, again, I'm talking about the popular discourse, little recognition of the problem, and the less recognition of the problem there is in popular discourse, the more political support there may be for doing stupid things.
You'll just have to write more op-eds for the Washington Post.
One last thing, I think underlying all of what several people have been saying is the old issue of decision theory. Something Justice Breyer and Judge Easterbrook in large part agree on, that antitrust is an administrative mechanism, and you have to, and if you don't know the answer for sure, the more complexity there is, the more you have to be worried about potential error costs. And that's something that, again, is not, I think, widely recognized by a lot of popular commentators on antitrust.
I'm going to say one thing about occupational licensure and for a moment. So because I took a crack at the concentration study, I would sort of double down on what Larry said. The Obama administration CEA report on occupational licensure is excellent. It's really, truly well done. And it has been an area where the FTC has been involved a long time. I think one of the sort of big bipartisan crown jewels of the FTC has been its advocacy efforts in those areas. I do agree, sort of in the inside baseball antitrust FTC world, occupational licensure, and it's getting, I think it is more popular in some ways to discuss it now than it has been for some time. Well, my view on this something else I've said, I wave around a piece of paper, in this area is, the FTC, for my money in this space, the advocacy we do, to state and local regulators and, with the taxi cab regulation or dentists or professions or sometimes in platform context, is really good stuff. One of the things that the agency used to do more of in that context is litigate. They used to go out and sue taxi cab commissions, or we do have North Carolina Board of Dentists, right? But we litigate far less often. There's an Uber case in St. Louis. There's the telemedicine case in Texas. These are cases where I think if an agency wants to put them front and center, there's the world is ripe with opportunity for agencies to the extent they want to make this part of their enforcement platform. Go litigate some cases and litigate them in markets that matter to people. I think telemedicine is a really big, important one. The taxi cab stuff is too. I would like to see the agencies do that.
Tom, can I make one comment? And this goes back to the concerns about declining competition, higher levels of concentration, and everyone has touched on this. Just in the interest of full information, the CEA study, the Council of Economic Advisors study that cites this, the top 50 firm statistics. That's not the only study out there. That is the most ridiculed or study, or the one that is least supported as making a more general case for declining competition. But, The Economist has done some work on this. There were also, I'm forgetting their names, but the guys from California who used web crawling techniques published a really interesting paper on using web crawling techniques to measure concentration in industries. There's amassing evidence. Concentration can be measured in a variety of different ways. From an antitrust frame, what really matters is concentration in relevant markets. And so what somebody should really do, if they have the time and the resources, is to go back through FTC complaints and DOJ complaints, competitive impact statements, and identify industries where you've seen successive merger activity. Oil field services and equipment would be a good one. There's health insurance would be another one, where the same markets have been successively consolidated, involving the same players making acquisitions and mergers. That's really the only way to get a really good metric of how concentration has increased in relevant markets, is by doing this across a variety of merger cases. I did this when I was a federal regulator in electricity markets because I was so irritated and annoyed at how the methodologies were so different. And in fact, we identified over time, a lot of these regional electricity markets had in fact become more concentrated because of successive merger activity. So let's not all dismiss the CEA and the Economist and the other studies that have been done. They're sort of all pointing in a direction which I think bears notice.
All right, if nobody else has a question, I'll give you a second one, and then we do have a kind of a light lunch that.
So going back to the earlier question, sorry, how do you think the government lawyers and the AT&T lawyers should explain antitrust economics in the upcoming vertical merger case, which has not been, which is a type of merger that hasn't been discussed by the courts for 40 years?
All right, let me jump in on the government side. And I give full credit to Steve Salop for explaining this to me in a clear way. It appeared on one of the AAI listserv messages. If Time Warner is, all right, the negotiations of Time Warner with distributors is all about bargaining. And just as an aside, bargaining theory, I think, is going to be the new thing for microeconomics over the next few years. One could argue auction theory has been the thing in the past, and then before that, asymmetric information, bargaining theory. And so Time Warner has to bargain with the distributors and come up with a price. If it stands alone, it's got some rock bottom price that it will accept. And below that, it says, no, not worth it. If it is integrated into AT&T, then that rock bottom price is going to be a higher number, because if the distributor doesn't buy the Time Warner products, it may lose some customers to AT&T. So there'll be some, and of course this is an empirical question. If it's only a handful, who cares? If it's a serious transfer, then it matters. But that will raise the minimum price that Time Warner would accept and raise prices more generally. I think that is explainable to a federal district court judge. Somebody want to?
All right, last question. Well, this is the last question.
Did I do Steve Stella?
You did him justice.
Yeah, wait.
I just wanted to follow up on what you just said about the AT&T merger, and I'd like for you to tell me how that differs from the behavioral conditions that were imposed in Comcast, NBC Universal, which had like 12 pages of behavioral conditions, and now DOJ seems to be moving away from behavioral to structural, and how spinning off CNN or DirecTV would actually remedy any problems that the DOJ sees.
Well, again, it comes back to this issue of what's the minimum price that CNN and Turner or whatever are going to accept. If they're part of an integrated AT&T, it's going to be a higher price. If they are standalone or they are part of some other organization that is not a downstream distributor, there won't be that tendency toward a higher price. Behavioral stuff in a perfect world might get you to the same place, but we know that with behavioral remedies, there's just too much room for finding ways around it, too much effort at a regulatory outcome that requires a federal district court judge and the Antitrust Division to be devoting way too many resources in that direction. That's why favoring structural over behavioral, I'll go there every time, and I think most of the people here at this table would as well.
Third option is just not to bring the case.
Well, okay.
So can I just add that this myth? There's a really good propaganda machine working out there on AT&T, Time Warner. It's a myth that the agencies have never taken on a vertical merger case. There have been Steve Salop has a great article where he goes back to 1994 and lists all the vertical merger cases that were challenged by the agencies. Yeah, they settled them out of court, and I think one or two went to court. But the fact that the agencies challenged those mergers, the fact that the parties accepted a settlement, signaled some perception of litigation risk on the part of the parties because they settled and they chose not to go to court. So they could have lost in court, and the government could have prevailed. So this silly argument that there's no precedent here, this is a tack off in a different direction. I think that's just hocus pocus. The government has been very active in vertical merger challenges, and oh, by the way, there have been way more structural remedies taken in vertical mergers than there seems to be public knowledge of. I just actually cataloged everything and developed a graph, as economists are wont to do, and to show accumulations of conduct remedies over time and structural remedies over time. So it's absolutely out there, and it's part of the education process about vertical deals.
I'll make a small comment, which is I totally agree. The agencies bring there's vertical consents. All the time is something like 1 to 2 a year. On average, I think if you look at what the FTC did, you find vertical or complementary products mergers, which raise the same issues. Nielsen Arbitron is one that I think is properly viewed as like a complementary products merger if you do it right. 1 a year, and there are years where you get 0. There are years where you get 2. So I think rare is fair. I think, at least relative to horizontal or something like that, I think unprecedented is unfair and not accurate. I will say part of the education process is exactly the point you make. Another part of the education process is, thanks to Steve Salop and other people, we now pretty well understand the conditions under which we should worry about those vertical theories. Right? We used to not. We used to just sort of shout vertical merger in a crowded room, and then the case would go whichever way it went. We understand pretty well when those conditions apply. We have a big body of empirical evidence that says it's much easier to tell the theory than to do it in practice, to actually have vertical merger sort of come out as anti-competitive. There's a great literature review by Francine LaFontaine and Margaret Slade. Francine was a Obama administration chief FTC economist that sort of counts up all of the studies that have been done in this area, and it turns out, I mean, we can quarrel on the margins on a couple of them, but overwhelmingly the evidence suggests that vertical mergers are either competitively neutral or pro-competitive. It doesn't mean they can't be anti-competitive or that they're not good cases. For what it's worth, my own read of the complaint is that complaints are early stage. I mean, you have different evidence later, but my own read of the complaint is that it's hard for me to imagine it getting to the place where it doesn't read to me like a complaint that suggests the DOJ is sitting on the type of evidence that would persuade an Article III judge that those conditions are satisfied. And so I think there are sort of ample opportunities to explain that to an Article III judge as well.
Okay. I'd like to thank the panel for a great discussion.